Time and Place by GingerBaggins, Chapter 3, Enticing Opportunities. Draco must have died at the Battle of Hogwarts. He'd been dropped into the flames of the fiend fire and burned and crisped alongside Crabbe. The last 6 years had merely been hallucinations. This was the only possible explanation for the series of events that had occurred. It made sense. Befriending the strange and often insufferable pairing of Potter and Weasley, being accepted by a group of his peers that he'd once tormented, being acquitted of crimes he surely deserved more punishment for, becoming free from the shackles of his family name, being offered a well-paying job as an Auror. Delusions, they must have been. None more so than what had happened the day before, something that had kept him awake all night with confusion and anticipation. Hermione Granger, the youngest unspeakable in Ministry history, with a famous dislike of one Draco Lucius Malfoy, had asked him to work with her. Draco was of course grateful for this current role. It had saved him from years in miserable, cold, and wet cell in Azkaban, and afforded him the independence he had so desperately sought from his parents after the war. But if he were given the choice, he would have kept to academia. Maybe became a professor, or, in his wildest fantasies, an unspeakable. Which is why Granger's offer was born out of a dying hallucination, though he fully intended to enjoy this delusion for as long as it lasted. If this truly were his life flashing before his eyes, he'd not done too badly, all things considered. "I knew she'd ask you." Potter had been a smug fool ever since Draco had brought up his friend's strange visit. "She's so bad at lying. It's brilliant." Draco did not want to remind Potter that he'd witnessed first-hand proof that Hermione Granger was very good at lying, no matter the personal cost of it. "I want the caramel," Draco said, pointing to the box of donuts that Ginevra had dropped off. She had of course pretended that she was passing through for a reason completely unrelated to seeing her adoring husband, but the donuts said otherwise. "You're having the coconut one," Weasley said, reaching over and grabbing at the box with all the grace of an ape. "I don't like the coconut," he replied calmly, considering which hex would keep Weasley's hands away from the caramel. They must be some potion masters in DOM. Why didn't she ask? There must be some potion master in the DOM. Why didn't she ask them? "She did," Potter laughed and set crumbs flying all over the office. Draco shuddered. "You weren't her first choice." "She even asked George," Weasley added. He knew he wouldn't have been her first choice. He was surprised to have even been her last, but the confirmation got his back up more than he wanted to admit. George Weasley didn't even complete his Hogwarts education. "That is absurd," he muttered, still eyeing the box. "Still, I don't know how this will work. She detests me." "Nah, she just doesn't like you. There's a difference." "Why are you two chatting with me then?" he asked, feeling defensive, or possibly insecure. He'd always struggled to differentiate between the two feelings. "I thought you lot made decisions as a 3. "She doesn't have a problem with it," Potter shrugged, pulling the box back to his lap and holding out the coconut donut for Draco. He did not take it. "I am certain she does," he countered. "She's never forgiven me." "Don't be daft. She forgave you years ago. We asked." Weasley laughed, fingers already twitching for the box and what was rightfully Draco's. He might have made a lunge for it. He might have challenged Weasley to a duel for it. He might have pushed back his hair and spat out some remark about incivility, but he could not when the admission had stunned him into a near-petrified state. "You are sure of this?" "Of course. No offense, mate, but if she had a problem with it, you'd be buying your own coconut donuts." "What exactly did she say?" "Merlin, I don't remember. It was years ago. I'm having the caramel." "I remember," Potter spoke. That horrible little glint in his eye had resurfaced. Draco had come to learn that it only ever meant trouble. "She said the git didn't deserve to be lonely forever." "She's a right sop," Weasley confirmed, the donut already halfway in his mouth. was all Draco could respond. Take the coconut, Malfoy. He pretended to file arrest reports for the remainder of the morning, frequently checking the clock in hopes that time might pass by with the same sense of haste he was feeling. He was to meet Granger at Kingsley's at 2 p.m. to make an unbreakable vow for something he knew quite literally nothing about. When the time finally came, he all but sprinted to the lifts, shuffling nervously as he navigated the long and purposefully wrapped corridors that led to the minister's office. The door was open already when he arrived. Granger and Kingsley were sitting there waiting as though he weren't 5 minutes early. He'd barely heard a word they said to him, though, the sound of his excitement buzzing in his ears. Will you vow to keep the nature of Miss Granger's work confidential no matter the circumstances? Yes. Will you agree to mandatory obliviation if you decide to turn the job down? Yes. Will you? Yes. Anything. He was still rubbing his wrist when Kingsley stepped out to give them time to discuss the nature of the project, by which point he was near hyperventilating. All right, Granger, tell me. Do you remember a rumor that went around in a third year regarding how I managed my schedule? She asked. Her eyes were shining, and he couldn't look away. I tried very hard to avoid any mention of you at all that year, he lied. Because of course he was lying. He knew exactly which rumor she was referring to. Granger had a fucking time turner. He'd heard it whispered across the tables of the Great Hall at every breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He'd seethed the whole year about how easily she seemed to best him in every class, especially as she was someone he'd foolishly deemed to possess lesser magic. It sounded so absurd to him now. I know. I didn't hit you that hard, Malfoy. You remember just fine. She smirked, and he let out a long breath through his nose. You had one, then? A time turner? He asked, the curiosity in his voice betraying the calm mask he presented. I knew it. No, you did not, she huffed. But yes, I had one. I still have one. Or the ministry has one, and I'm encouraged to experiment with it. You are experimenting with time? He asked, incredulous. She merely nodded. That is wildly dangerous, Granger. I did warn you that it would be. You did, he confirmed. What do you need a potions master for? It didn't matter. He was on board. The excitement was bubbling in his chest, warming its way up his throat with such intensity that he worried it would escape as a ghastly giggle, and she'd never let him live it down. He had to be calm for the sake of his dignity, but in truth, she could tell him she needed him to mop the floors while she brewed, and he'd take it. The further back we go, the more unstable it becomes to travel. I am spending extended periods in the past. I thought they only allowed up to 5 hours, he interjected, unable to control himself. Her face broke into a bewildering, wondrous smile at his words. He had just admitted to having researched time turners, and it didn't take a brain like Granger's to figure out what had pushed him to do so. I told you, I've been experimenting, she explained without explaining it all. Now, I am able to return to present time easily enough, give or take an hour, but my body still feels the effects of the passage. Meaning? Meaning my body is a year older than it should be at this point. If I'm to continue my research, and it is of great importance that I do, I need something to make sure I'm not old and haggard by the time I'm 30. She said this with a small shrug, as though it was not one of the most insane things anyone had ever uttered. We learned to brew aging potions in 4th year, he reminded her, frowning. She was perfectly irritatingly capable of brewing one herself. Merlin, I can't believe I've not thought of that before, she said, voice as flat as the floor, eyes narrowed at him. If it were that simple, I'd have not bothered with you. Glad to see that extra year had softened you, he teased, but she did not see the funny side. Aging potions are temporary and unstable. They also do not reverse the effects of aging. They're merely tricks. You know this. Her hands were on her hips now, the way they always were when she was telling off Potter and Weasley, the way they were 6 years ago when she gave him one of the most memorable verbal dressing downs of his life. I don't need to become older or younger. I need to stabilize my aging altogether. Oh. Granger wanted him to invent an age-suspending potion. That's impossible, he whispered, and an evil little smile pulled at her lips. No, it's improbable. How long would you need it to last? Ideally months, but we can settle for weeks. He laughed, a panic and strangled sound, and took his perch off the tree chair. His fingers tangled themselves in his hair, pulling strands loose from the charm he spent too long securing. This was an insane thing to ask of him, of anyone. I am aware this is a project that could take a significant amount of time. Granger, this has never been done before. Anything I brew could kill you. He groaned. This was unbelievable. All this time, all this work, and he was going to end up killing Hermione Granger anyway. I'm not an idiot, Malfoy. I'm not going to be drinking anything without significant testing. I'm not sure about this, he admitted, feeling the sting of devastation. He'd been so excited, but she was asking him to take too much of a risk. He had no interest in causing her or anyone else for that matter any more harm than he already had. That's all right, she said, sounding equally as disappointed. I understand. I'll remove the memory of this conversation. Your vow will be completed, and you will be free to return to the DMLE. Draco blinked. What? I said you'll be free to... And then who will you ask? He asked, eyes snapping back to hers, a panic rising in his throat. You've exhausted the ministry options. I'll find someone, she smiled kindly, too kindly, and gestured for him to stand in front of her. It'll only take a minute. You might have a slight headache, but I've got some... No, I'm doing it. He wasn't exactly sure what possessed him to say it. Maybe it was the residual excitement that came with the possibility of academic breakthrough. Maybe it was the lifelong desire to work down in the DOM. Maybe it was the itch to get in front of his cauldron, or the possibility of working with Granger as an intellectual equal instead of an adversary. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the thought of her putting her life in the hands of someone who didn't know quite how precious of a thing it was. At least Draco knew exactly what was the risk and who was at risk. You are? She asked, hesitant, hopeful. I am. And that's the end of chapter 3.